The relentless Arizona sun beat down on the cracked earth, mirroring the dryness in Silas Thorne's heart. His ranch, a solitary outpost of weathered wood and sun-scorched fences, felt more like a tomb than a home since his wife Eleanor passed 2 years prior. He was a man of few words, his life reduced to the rhythmic solitary work of a rancher, mending fences, tending to the herd, and fighting the endless dust. The only sound was the wind, a mournful whisper through the cholla cactus. One sweltering afternoon, a flicker of movement on the horizon caught his eye. 2 figures, small and hurried, moved along the dusty trail that led to his land. As they drew closer, he saw them clearly. A girl, no older than 12, her tattered dress caked in a fine layer of dust, and a boy, maybe 5, clutched to her side. They were exhausted, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Silas, a man who had sworn off emotional entanglements, felt a stir he hadn't known since Eleanor's death. He met them at the well, his silhouette long and imposing against the afternoon light. The girl, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance, pulled the boy protectively behind her. "We ran from Mama's new man," she said, her voice a small, brittle thing. "He's not a good man. He hits." The last words were a whisper, but they hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. The boy, his thumb in his mouth, just stared, a silent plea in his eyes. Silas, without a word, extended a hand towards the well bucket. "You can drink, both of you." The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her guard slightly lowered. He watched as they drank, the water spilling onto their dusty clothes. The simple act of kindness broke something in him. A wall he had spent 2 years building. He couldn't send them away. He wouldn't. "My name's Silas Thorne," he said, his voice rough. "You can stay here for a while." The girl, her name was Clara, and her brother was Finn, looked at him, not with gratitude but with a cautious hope. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of their shared pasts and the uncertain future. Clara and Finn's presence shattered the quiet monotony of the ranch. The small, isolated cabin, once silent, now held the murmur of children's voices. Finn's infectious laughter, a sound Silas hadn't heard in years, echoed from the porch as he chased after a stray hen. Clara, wary but hard-working, took to chores with a surprising diligence. She swept the dust from the floorboards, cooked simple meals of beans and biscuits, and mended their own clothes with a needle and thread Silas provided. Silas, in turn, found himself adapting. He taught Clara how to saddle a horse, her small hands fumbling with the leather straps at first, then gaining confidence. He showed Finn how to whittle small figures from wood, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he guided the boys. They ate their meals in silence at first, the rhythmic clinking of forks on plates the only sound. Slowly, a tentative conversation began. Clara told him stories of their life on the road, of the endless parade of saloons and dirty rooms. Finn, with the innocent honesty of a child, drew pictures of a man with a dark beard and angry eyes. Silas, a man who had spent his life dealing with the brutality of nature, was learning about a different kind of cruelty, a human one. The local townsfolk, a tight-knit and suspicious bunch, gossiped about the children at Silas's ranch. The storekeeper, a man named Bartholomew, gave Silas a knowing look when he bought extra flour and sugar. "Heard you got some company, Silas," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. Silas, his face a mask of stone, simply nodded. The children were his responsibility now, and he felt a fierce, protective instinct towards them. He had a new purpose, and for the first time in a long time, the dust on his land felt less like a curse and more like the ground he was meant to protect. The peace was a fragile thing, a temporary shelter from the storm they had left behind. One morning, as Silas and Clara were mending a fence post, a rider approached. He was a large man, his face a jumble of angry lines, his clothes a permanent state of disarray. He had a cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. Clara froze, her face draining of all color. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mama's new man, Buck." Buck dismounted with a swagger, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with an invasive greed. He saw Clara, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and then his gaze settled on Silas, a silent challenge. "Heard you were harboring some runaways, Thorn," he said, his voice a low growl. "Those children are my responsibility. Their mama sent me to get them." He gestured towards the fence post Silas was mending, a mocking glint in his eyes. "You're a man of the law, are you?" Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Buck and Clara. "They're staying here," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "They're safe." The tension in the air was palpable, a coiled snake ready to strike. Buck's hand hovered over the pistol on his hip, a familiar threat. "Their mama's worried sick," he lied, his lips curled into a sneer. "It's a long way back to town." Clara, her fear turning into a cold resolve, stepped out from behind Silas. "Mama didn't send you," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You're a liar. You hurt people." Buck's sneer hardened into a scowl. "Watch your mouth, girl," he spat. He looked at Silas, a new plan forming in his eyes. "I'll be back," he promised, his voice a chilling whisper. "And I won't be so friendly." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Silas looked at Clara, her small shoulders squared, her eyes blazing with a newfound courage. He knew then that this wasn't just about protecting two children. It was about standing up to a sickness, a kind of evil that thrived in the shadows. The arrival of Buck had shaken the ranch, but it had also solidified a bond between Silas, Clara, and Finn. They were no longer just a rancher and two children. They were a family, forged in the heat of a shared threat. Silas, a man who had believed his life was over, felt a stirring of something he hadn't known in years, a quiet, blossoming hope. He began to see Clara and Finn not as a burden, but as a chance to rewrite his own story. Clara, no longer the scared little girl from the trail, was blossoming under Silas's care. She was quick to learn, her mind sharp and her spirit resilient. She had a natural affinity for horses and spent hours in the stable, talking to them in hushed tones. Silas, watching her, was reminded of Eleanor, of her quiet strength and her love for all living things. Finn, meanwhile, was a constant source of light, his laughter a balm to Silas's weary soul. He found himself telling the boy stories of the ranch, of the stars, of the long-ago days when the land was wilder. One evening, after the sun had set and the stars began to pinprick the inky sky, Silas and Clara sat on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. "You remind me of my wife," Silas said, the words surprising even himself. "She was a good woman." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. "I bet she was," she said. "She'd be proud of you for helping us." The simple words, spoken with a child's unvarnished honesty, were a comfort to Silas. The townsfolk, who had initially been suspicious, began to warm to the new family. The local baker, a kind woman named Martha, began to leave extra loaves of bread for Silas, a silent gesture of support. Bartholomew, the storekeeper, no longer gossiped, but instead offered advice on what kind of feed would be best for the children's new pets, a couple of stray chickens Finn had adopted. The ranch, once a lonely fortress, was becoming a home, its walls not just for protection, but for a new, fragile life. Buck's return was inevitable. He rode into town on a Sunday, his presence a dark stain on the otherwise peaceful day. He spread his lies, telling anyone who would listen that Silas Thorn had stolen his children, and that their mother, his wife, was desperate for their return. Some people, distrustful of outsiders, believed him. Others, who had seen the change in Silas and the happiness of the children, did not. The town was divided, a whispered war of words echoing through the dusty streets. Silas, a man who had always avoided conflict, was forced to confront it head-on. He stood on the porch of the general store, his back straight, his eyes meeting the gazes of his neighbors. "Buck is a liar," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. He is no father to those children. He is a monster. Buck, hearing the commotion, emerged from the saloon, his face a mask of feigned outrage. "You're slandering me, Thorn," he bellowed. "I'll have the law on you." But the law, in the form of Sheriff Hank, was a sensible man. He had seen the bruised look in Clara's eyes when she first arrived, and he had seen the quiet love in Silas's. "I've seen the papers, Buck," he said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "The children's mother is long gone, and you're a wanted man for assault in 2 different territories. Now get out of my town before I throw you in a cell." Buck, defeated but not broken, glared at Silas. "This isn't over, Thorn," he said, his voice a low snarl. "You'll pay for this." He mounted his horse and rode out of town, a defeated man but still a dangerous one. The town, which had been holding its breath, let out a collective sigh. The conflict had been resolved, but the tension lingered, a reminder that the world was still full of people like Buck. Silas, his shoulders squared, looked at the townspeople. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had found a new place for himself, not just as a rancher, but as a man of principle. The months that followed were a quiet balm on the raw wounds of the past. The ranch, once a place of silent grief, now echoed with the sounds of a family. Clara blossomed under Silas's care, her natural affinity for the land a mirror of his own. Her small frame, once brittle with fear, was now strong and capable. She helped with the herd, her movements surprisingly adept with a lasso. Finn, no longer a silent shadow, chattered endlessly about the world he was discovering, from the tiny lizards that sunned themselves on the rocks to the constellations that lit the desert sky. Silas, in turn, found a quiet joy in watching them, a fulfillment he had not known was possible. But the ranch wasn't the only place where a new life was taking root. In town, Silas had met Sarah. She had arrived as the new schoolteacher, a quiet, kind woman with a fiery spirit. She had taken Clara under her wing, teaching her to read and write with a patience that astounded Silas. It was through Clara that Silas had come to know her, and he found himself drawn to her grace and courage. She saw in him a man of quiet strength and deep integrity, and he, in turn, saw a woman who could meet the harshness of the world with a gentle yet unbreakable resolve. Their conversations were easy, a welcome departure from the solitary work of the ranch. They talked of books, of the history of the land, and of the simple, honest work of building a life. One evening, as they sat on her porch, the setting sun casting long shadows, Silas found himself telling her about Eleanor, about the grief that had consumed him. Sarah listened, her hand resting gently on his. "You're a good man, Silas," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's time to stop living in the past and start living in the present." Her words, a quiet challenge, were a turning point for Silas. He knew she was right. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Silas, who had believed his heart was a closed book, found himself opening it, a page at a time. He began to look forward to his trips to town, not just for supplies, but for a chance to see her, to hear her voice. He saw in her a new kind of future, a future that was not a replacement for what he had lost, but a new, beautiful beginning. The ranch was full of life, not just from the children, but from the animals as well. A new litter of puppies had arrived, and Finn, with Sarah's help, had been tasked with caring for them. It was a perfect small world, a bubble of peace in a harsh land. But a storm was gathering on the horizon, not just in the weather, but in the lingering threat of Buck. The news came from a neighboring town, a letter from a former acquaintance of Silas. Buck had been seen, and he was asking about Silas. He had made a new acquaintance, a low-life gang of outlaws with a reputation for violence and revenge. Silas knew what this meant. Buck wasn't just coming back for the children. He was coming back to make Silas pay. He couldn't go to the law. Buck's new friends would be a problem for the sheriff and his small team. Silas had to face this alone, as he had always faced everything else. He told Clara and Finn what he had to do. "I need to go away for a while," he said, his voice steady, masking the turmoil within. "I'll be back." Clara, her eyes wise beyond her years, looked at him, knowing he wasn't telling the whole truth. "Don't go alone," she said. But Silas, a man who had always relied on his own strength, was determined to face this on his own terms. He had to protect the children, and that meant keeping them out of harm's way. He rode to Sarah's house, his heart heavy with the weight of the coming storm. He told her everything, the threat, the danger, and his plan to ride out to meet Buck on his own. Sarah, her face etched with worry, listened, then shook her head. "You can't do this alone, Silas," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "You have a family now." He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not just fear, but a fierce determination. She saw him not just as a man to be protected, but as a man to be fought for. In that moment, he realized that he had been fighting alone for too long. He had a family, and a family meant not just protecting them, but allowing them to protect him in return. After a long night of quiet reflection, the new day's sun seemed to bring a chilling clarity to Silas. He knew running was a fool's errand. He was a man of the land, not a fugitive. He found Clara and Finn sitting on the porch, Finn sketching something with a stick in the dirt, Clara watching him with the quiet intensity that had become her defining trait. "Listen to me," Silas began, his voice low but firm. "Buck is coming. He's got others with him now. We can't stay here, and we can't outrun them, not for long." Clara's eyes widened with a mix of fear and relief. The unspoken terror of the inevitable confrontation had been a heavy weight on her small shoulders. Finn, sensing the gravity in Silas's tone, stopped his drawing and looked up, his thumb slowly finding his mouth. He no longer saw Silas as a stern rancher, but as his protector, a father in every sense but name. They moved with a silent, practiced efficiency, gathering the few belongings that now defined their life on the ranch. Silas packed his most valuable supplies, his well-oiled shotgun, his trusty rifle, and the last of his ammunition. He had to be prepared. He couldn't be caught by surprise, not with 2 small lives depending on him. Their new plan was to ride to a distant town, a place far from Buck's shadow, where they could start over. A new name, a new life, a new chance. But fate, as it often does in the desert, had a different plan. The sound of a horse galloping hard and fast broke the morning stillness. It was Bartholomew, the storekeeper, his face pale and streaked with dust. He dismounted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "They're coming, Silas," he gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "They're riding fast, and they're armed. I saw them from the ridge." Silas felt a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. They were out of time. There was no running. He had to make a stand. He had to protect his family, not by running, but by fighting. He looked at the children, their faces a mixture of fear and trust, and a resolve hardened in his heart. He led them to a small, hidden cave he had discovered years ago, a secret he had kept for a time such as this. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice a low rumble. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't come out until I come for you. Promise me." Clara, her small hands clutching Finn's, looked at him, her eyes filled with a new kind of fear, a fear for him. "Promise me you'll come back," she pleaded, her voice a small, fragile thing. Silas, his face a mask of grim determination, nodded. "I promise." It was a lie of necessity, a promise he might not be able to keep. But he had to give her something to hold on to, a sliver of hope to cling to in the dark. As he watched them disappear into the shadows of the cave, he felt the full weight of his responsibility settle on him. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a father, a protector, and he was ready to do what needed to be done. The outlaws rode onto Silas's ranch like a swarm of angry locusts, a dark, menacing cloud of dust and cruelty. Buck was at the head, his eyes narrowed, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. "Nowhere to run, Thorn," he said, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "It's just you and me." Silas, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands steady on his rifle, stood his ground. He was outnumbered, but this was his land. He knew every dip and rise, every shadow and every hiding place. He moved like a ghost through the landscape he had so meticulously worked, a fierce, primal strength fueling him. He was no longer fighting for just his own life, but for the lives of the children hiding in the cave. The gunshots echoed through the canyon, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of dust and sagebrush, a harsh symphony of violence. But Silas wasn't alone. In the midst of the chaos, a single shot rang out from the distance, followed by another and then another. The outlaws, confused and disoriented, looked for the source of the gunfire. It was Sheriff Hank, his familiar silhouette a beacon of justice against the setting sun. Behind him, a small posse of townsfolk had gathered, including Bartholomew, his face pale but determined, and even Sarah, her hands clutching a rifle, her face a mask of fierce resolve. They had come to help, a silent promise kept, a testament to the community that had grown around Silas and the children. The outlaws, caught between Silas and the posse, panicked and fled, leaving Buck alone to face the man he had underestimated from the start. The two men, enemies from different worlds, stood face to face. Buck, defeated but still defiant, drew his pistol, a desperate last resort. "It's over, Buck," Silas said, his voice a low growl. Buck's eyes filled with a desperate animalistic rage, and he fired. But Silas was faster. His shot found its mark, and Buck fell, a defeated man, a life of cruelty finally over. Silas, bruised and weary, walked to the cave. He called out Clara and Finn's names, his voice hoarse from the fight. They emerged, their faces streaked with tears and dirt, their bodies trembling. Clara, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief, ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a sob. Silas, holding her close, felt a new kind of love, a love born not of blood, but of shared struggle and a shared future. The townsfolk who had stood by him gathered at the ranch. They were no longer just neighbors. They were his family. Sarah, her eyes full of relief and love, walked to him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She didn't have to say a word. Her presence was a promise, a silent understanding of a new life, a new beginning. The ranch, once a place of loneliness and despair, was now a home, a sanctuary of hope and new beginnings. The sun, a new day dawning, cast a golden light on the weathered wood and the sun-scorched earth. Clara and Finn were no longer just runaways. They were children with a home, with a family, with a father who had fought for them, and with a community that had stood by them. Silas, a man who had believed his story was over, was now a man with a new purpose, a new family, and a new life. The dust on his land was no longer a sign of despair, but a foundation for a new, beautiful world, a world where love, hope, and courage had found a home.